just winter wonderland life out here, as you can see. Okay. What you thought when you saw that opening footage? I was a real booktuber like Emmy or Bookleo. Got you. The camera doesn't have a flip screen, so I have no idea what I look like. I don't know what you see. Stacked on a couple of books. My laptop is behind it because I needed it to plug in my ring light, so it's kind of holding on for dear life on the chair. There's a lot going on. 2021, y'all. It's been a year that happened. There's a comic that I read recently. I don't even know if it's a recent comic, but I saw it in a newspaper that I clipped out months ago. And there are two people standing in a room, and one of them says, "Is it Tuesday or Thursday or June?" And the other one just replies, "Yes." Mood. Okay, enough of all that preamble. Once we know each other better, you'll know that my little asides, the little anecdotes, listen. If Homer was allowed to do it in the Odyssey, I can do it in my own gosh darn booktube video, okay? Speaking of the Odyssey, we're gonna talk about that. Essentially, my thought behind this video was I had a really good reading year, me personally, and despite the chaos going on the earth, I read a lot of books. I actually hit my goal of 50 books. They were a solid 50, well, most of them were really good. We'll get to it. So I just thought, you know what, I'm gonna look around, suss out what's going on booktube, see if there are any good end of year book tags, and I found one that I really liked, so I decided I would do it. And all credits to that original, or at least to my knowledge, it's the original developer of that tag down below. Their name escapes me, but it's down there, and it was really good. There were 10 categories. I added a bonus one for reasons we'll get to, because there was a book that needed to be discussed that didn't make the cut for the other 10 questions. Let's just get into it. The first prompt was the longest book that you read this year. This was an easy one. I didn't have to think about it. This was just objective. It was Eric Stevenson's Malazan book number 1, Gardens of the Moon. 703 pages. No. Yes. 703 pages, plus there was a glossary, but I didn't. It was 703 pages. I do not typically read a lot of high fantasy. We're starting in a weird place here. This is not, no. I read this at the recommendation of my partner because he is a huge fan of epic high fantasy series, and this is his absolute favorite. He said this is the peak of the genre. If you read epic high fantasy, feel free to discuss. I like this. This was a 3-star read out of 5 for me. I thought it was fine. It did a lot of the things that epic high fantasy does that kind of make me gravitate away from it. I don't particularly like having to get thrown into learning a magic system, learning a new world, and all of the sort of fantasy names that come along with it. Just none of that is super appealing to me. I enjoyed actually his writing style, Erickson's writing style. I thought it was very nice. I thought, considering the absolute, like, just sheer amount of things that needed to be learned to really understand what was even happening in this book, his sentences, like, individually actually did a lot of work helping to propel those things forward. So you weren't getting hampered down by semicolons and dead-end asides and just like weird monster sentences that never really went anywhere. We had some nice little poetic language going on in here, but for the most part the writing itself was functional, and it did what it needed to do. What can I even say about this book? I feel like I'm jumping all around. This was 703 pages, so there was a lot going on. I don't want to focus the entire video on just this, but it was an experience for me just getting through a book like this. Epic high fantasy readers are the real heroes. Like, I read, and we'll see like some examples of some classical literature and just like literary fiction. We, readers of those, we're not the true heroes. These people are the heroes. The authors of epic high fantasy series. This series has 3.5 or almost 3.5 million words across about 10 books. What? Does Erickson just live in this world? Does he ever come up for air? How? And ditto to the people who read these. Not on the same plane of existence. Would I continue with this series? I'm not sure I'm brave enough, but it's good. Is there a plot? Not really. This is very much setting up what is clearly going to be going on across the remaining 9 books in this series, but nothing gets resolved in this. You meet a bunch of people, they come together, they separate, they come back together at the end. A couple of people die. There were dragons. There were some other creatures towards the climax of this, but for the most part, this is political intrigue before anything else. And if you liked the Game of Thrones series, or you liked the Song of Fire, or a Song of Ice and Fire, that series, you would probably like this, I would assume, especially if that sort of political aspect of it really appeals to you in fantasy. It was a very long book. Now, the second part to the first question, after what was just objectively the longest book you read, was what was the book that took you the longest to read? I'm cheating here because this is not factually true. But the book that it felt like it took me the longest to read, hilariously, was the Odyssey. This is where we get into the tea. The Odyssey, in my opinion, was not good. At the beginning of this year, I read the Iliad for the first time, and it really blew me away. It didn't make the cut for any of these other particular questions, but it was really, really good. It was one of the best books I read this year. The characters in that and the way that the plot is set up, if you're not familiar with the Iliad, this is the, Trojan horse, although it's not in the Iliad. Trojan War, Helen is being fought for. They're the Trojans on one side, the Achaeans on the other side, Achilles is in that story. What's nice about the Iliad is I feel like it feels like an epic. It feels really huge. You get an understanding of how the gods work within Greek mythology. It's a really good introduction, I think, to some of those gods, because you get just a handful of them who are involved in this conflict, and it's really understandable what roles they play. Who they are behind, who they're backing, and so on. And it has these questions about when is it acceptable or not acceptable to not follow your commander, to defect, those kinds of more, I guess, philosophical questions in terms of warfare. Whereas the Odyssey is a string of incidents, episodes, if you will, strung together by this plot in which Odysseus's wife, who was left behind when he went to go fight in the war at Troy, has to fend off a bunch of suitors, because now that the war has been over for almost 10 additional years, people are thinking, okay, Odysseus is dead, he's not coming back, girl, it's time to remarry. And she doesn't want to, so she sort of stonewalls against these suitors who are now eating her out of house and home. Her son is useless and doesn't do really anything to stop him, or to stop the suitors from being really just generally rude and bad guests. Which is a major theme in this, by the way. If you're a bad guest in the Odyssey, you are going to die. Yeah, I don't know. The plot is very, very weak. Incredibly small and petty, because basically all that needs to happen is Odysseus needs to get back to give the suitors what for, and that's it. Most of it is Odysseus getting buffeted from place to place and telling these stories, like the famous ones, with the Cyclops, hearing the sirens, getting stuck on the island with Circe. He's just telling these stories to people who host him along his journey home. And he's so unlikable. See, the thing with the Iliad also is that even though our central character, Achilles, is incredibly arrogant and a little bit childish in some ways, he feels charismatic. Like, you can kind of understand why everybody follows him, even though he has these really horrible qualities. Whereas with Odysseus, there is a lot of time dedicated to us being told how clever he is and how he's a master tactician. The only time, arguably, that we ever see him do anything remarkably clever is how he gets some of his followers out of the Cyclops' cave. That's it. That was clever. Everything else just feels, honestly, kind of douchey. I don't mean to use such a lowbrow term to describe this character, but I find myself struggling to find any other adjective that is appropriate. He's so arrogant and entitled, and nobody pushes back against it ever. He gets completely uplifted by everyone who agree that he is amazing and deserving of being given all of these treasures and this wealth to take back to Ithaca. No, I did not care for the Odyssey. Next. So the third question was about a book that you read that was outside your normal wheelhouse. For me, that was also very easy. Something that is really outside of my wheelhouse is sci-fi. I have read an incredibly limited selection of sci-fi stories. But anyway, so this year I read Neuromancer by William Gibson, which I think, from the research that I've done into this and also just having read it, I feel like is a really important piece of the sci-fi literary sort of canon. And anybody who is really into sci-fi, if you haven't read this, I think you probably should, because this feels like a very grounding text that I feel, even with my limited proximity to sci-fi, you can see the influence of on a lot of other things that came after it, including but not limited to the Matrix film series, which is pretty obviously inspired by elements of this. This story is basically the tale of our protagonist, whose name is Case. He's a hacker who gets caught up in this really elaborate plot to hack into a particular system to release this AI being so that it can evolve into something beyond what has ever been seen in the realm of sci-fi before, or in sci-fi, the realm of AI before. For reasons unknown to me, my camera turned off. It had had enough. I don't know where we were. Something Neuromancer. What I thought was really amazing about this book, the actual experience of reading this was really novel for me. I have never felt so disoriented by a book as I felt by this. There were so many times where I would read a passage and I would get to the end of it and I would think, what? And it wasn't because it was convoluted either. That was the thing that was so interesting. It was very simple. His actual writing style is very simple, and also his ability to develop this world within the Matrix is so outside my frame of reference that I actually just lack, for lack of a better word, the experience to picture it. Like I said, it feels like time travel. It feels like I have been plopped in the year like 3000 or something and given a book that was written at that contemporary time and expected to read it as though I understand what all of this means. I had a really interesting long conversation with one of my book club partners about this book, and we were able to talk ourselves into and out of this being dystopian. I think you could very easily make that argument that this is incredibly dystopian and that it is a critique of the internet and of the fusion of humans and machines and those kinds of typical sort of sci-fi thematic questions. But at the same time, you could also very easily argue the opposite, and that this world creates the possibility for people to actually come together. So different aspects of the technology could really allow you to argue this in either direction, and I think that that's a more nuanced and realistic take than others. Wow, this is such a great thing. We're starting off with 3 books that two of which I thought were meh, and one of which I didn't like. I promise I do like things. It's just, I don't know, the way the questions were worded, just this is where we are. Next. So the next section is books that you reread, and of the books that you reread, what was your favorite? I reread 3. They're eclectic, so bear with me. I reread Seawolf by Jack London. I reread Goosebumps number 55, The Blob That Ate Everyone by R.L. Stine. And I reread The Confusions of Young Torless by Robert Musil. This is the one that I like the best. This is just one of my favorite books of all time, point blank period. It's not his most famous work. His most famous work is probably Der Mann ohne Eigenschaften, or like The Man Without Qualities. But this one's my personal favorite. It was probably the first literary book that I ever read where I picked it up kind of on my own, didn't really know what to expect, and I thought thoughts. I've reread this book probably a total of 4 or 5 times since I read it the first time as a teenager, and every time I read it I feel like I get something else out of it. This book is really weird to talk about though, because it is so unpleasant. Like, everything about this is very unpleasant in terms of the plot, but it is a book that I have always really found fascinating. I think it is the best, in my opinion, of the sort of anti-coming of age subgenre. It's essentially my Catcher in the Rye. I loathe the Catcher in the Rye, but I can recognize that this falls into the same subgenre where the protagonist doesn't really have a coming of age arc. They get stunted by their own ego. This book, it takes place at an Austrian military boarding school at the turn of the 20th century, and the main character, Torless, has 2 friends who are the 2 sort of top dog but also big bad bullies of this school. He himself is not a bully, but he's sort of the follower of their little trio. He has returned to school for another year, and they catch one of their classmates stealing money out of a locker. The kid that they catch stealing begs them not to tell, and he says basically, I will do anything, please just don't tell, that would ruin my life. Because they're bullies, and they now have this kid under their power, they decide to really push that. And they're just like, what can we get away with, basically? How much can we get away with? One of the bullies is your traditional sort of rock 'em, sock 'em, beat 'em up, take their lunch money kind of guy. And then the other one is more of the sort of sociopathic character who probably killed insects with magnifying glasses. It's pretty grim. There is, as a sort of trigger warning for this book, there is some pretty explicit and also implicit sexual assault in this book, as well as, again, your sort of typical rock 'em, sock 'em, beat 'em up action. And it's very, very creepy. This is a very creepy book because Torless does nothing. That's basically the crux of this, is that while his 2 friends are torturing their classmate, he observes and is trying to understand how he feels about it. Am I making you want to read this yet? Musil's a really, really good writer too. I think what I really respect about this as well is just how well he captures teenagerness. The way these people talk, no. This is like classic literary fiction, so none of these people talk like real people. They're kind of vehicles for these ideas that Musil was chewing over when he was writing this, but you do really get a sense in the way that they all interact with each other, the kind of smugness that Torless feels when he's talking to the adults at the school, where he feels like he understands the world so much better than they do. At one point he describes how he doesn't like going to sleep because it feels like you're dying overnight, and he doesn't understand how adults can tolerate this. I really, really enjoy this in the same way that I think a lot of people, again, enjoy The Catcher in the Rye, or a lot of people enjoy Lord of the Flies. You like that kind of thing, and children being really sadistic to be a good read. join me on the dark side and give this a try. Okay, next up we have a book that you're reading for the first time, but you could see yourself rereading in the future. This is me showing what kind of books I really like, by the way. We have John Gardner's Grendel. Loved it, stunning. There is just something in me that loves a good, twisted, really morally reprehensible protagonist. I live for that. And this gives that to you for sure. This, as you can kind of perhaps surmise from the title, is a retelling of Beowulf, but from the perspective of Grendel. Do you need to have read Beowulf before you read this to really get it? I wrestled with this when I was thinking about it, but I think ultimately I would say yes, it's probably better to have read Beowulf to feel that sort of flipped script that this is going for, but I wouldn't say it's absolutely necessary. When I say it's a retelling of Beowulf, it is, but Beowulf only comes into it at the very, very end. So we actually get to see somewhat Grendel's origin story. Think of this as like Maleficent to Disney's Sleeping Beauty. This is the same kind of vibe, except Grendel is still a monster. Grendel, at the end of this, is not sympathetic. Like, this isn't one of those things where it's like he was secretly misunderstood. No, Grendel is the bad guy. It reminded me of Lolita. The reason that I make that comparison is because Lolita is also a novel wherein we have this objectively, by every metric, reprehensible protagonist, but they're very, very charming. When you go into a book like Lolita and when you go into a book like this, you know that this is an unreliable narrator. You know that this is the bad guy. And yet, because we're put inside their minds and they are giving us selective information about what's going on through the filter of themselves as the hero, it's very, very easy as the reader to fall in under the spell of these characters. And with Grendel, more so than in Lolita, humor plays a big role in that. Grendel is very funny, and funny as in like he can be the butt of his own joke. Some of the information that he chooses to give us selectively are moments wherein he looks ridiculous. And I think that that helps develop a sense of camaraderie between him as a protagonist and you as the reader, because that breaks down this barrier of mystique, it breaks down this barrier of separateness, because we've all felt ridiculous, you know, we've all tripped and fallen over, right? And I think that that in this is insidious, but so good, because doesn't that happen in real life too? I mean, we see this, and I think these types of books are so useful for helping us remember that that can happen, and that we really have to kind of shake ourselves a little bit when we find ourselves falling under the spell of charisma, and to really analyze what it is that we're rooting for. It doesn't matter that Grendel is funny and relatable and presented as a soft boy. Irrelevant. He's murdering people. Even he at one point gives into this notion that his malevolence is just an intrinsic part of himself. So he knows he's the bad guy. He tells you this, and yet he wants you to feel sorry for him in such a way that you excuse some of those actions, or even maybe root for him. Just like Humbert Humbert knows, and we know, that Humbert Humbert is the pentapod monster. And yet we root for him. Why? Because like any charismatic villain, you like him, despite everything that you know that he's done. And this works very similarly. It's a very specific gimmick within fiction, but ooh, I love it. Can't get enough of it. Read this. The next prompt asked for our favorite short story or novella that we read this year. I actually read, for me, quite a few novellas and short story collections, so I had a lot to choose from. I ultimately decided to choose the one that felt the most significant to me, in the sense that reading this that I'm about to talk about really felt like the coming together of a lot of other reading that I've done before. So I picked Mikhail Kuzman's Wings. This is an important book, just generally speaking, if you're interested in queer literature, because it is cited, at least among a lot of the sources that I have seen, as the first major Russian work to discuss the issue of homosexuality, as they mention on the back of this edition. Anyway, and I would say it's also very interesting because it exists at this intersection between your sort of historical figures like Oscar Wilde and the way that the gays were viewed at the time of his life, and also the work of E.M. Forster, specifically Maurice, or Morris if you're British, for a couple of reasons. The Oscar Wilde connection to me is that this book concerns itself very much with homosexuality as it is connected to the concept of pederasty. That is not going to be everybody's cup of tea, but again, anyone who's familiar with not only queer literature, but just the history of queer folk in general, you probably wouldn't be surprised to hear this come up, especially considering that at least at the end of the 19th century, that was a massive influence on queer culture, this association and sort of resonance with the Greek man-boy love experience. And so consequently, a lot of the discourse at the time centered around that being what normalized homosexuality. Well, historically it existed in man-boy love, in pederasty, in ancient Greek, and therefore it's not unnatural, it's not new, yada yada. It's a little bit of a yikesy byline by today's standards, but it's just something to keep in mind when you're reading queer literature, specifically from the Victorian period and maybe even Edwardian and slightly beyond that. Man-boy love within the queer community has a very long and storied history that we can't really get into here, but I would just be advised that that plays a huge role in this specifically. That's a huge part of the context. That's what the story is about. The main character is Vanya, and he is a teenager who, throughout the course of the novel, it does that classical coming to terms with his sexuality and deciding whether or not to accept his inner nature. And he does. Spoilers. This is an example of queer joy in fiction. And I say that, again, despite the sort of dicey, yikesy, man-boy love power imbalance aspects to this, this is not really considering that as a part of its own context. It's really thinking of itself as the gays can be happy too. Indeed, Kuzman really pushes this hard. Not only does he make the argument that being gay can still bring with it joy and beauty, but that it brings more than for straight people. I'm adding this language because it's really hard to talk about historical queer fiction because the language has changed so much, so forgive me if I mix and match here a little bit, but anyway. This works in the book's favor and against it in some ways, this notion that queerness elevates you in terms of the human experience that you're able to have, because he really works hard to tie it to aestheticism and to tie it to Hellenism and hedonism and a lot of those isms that were really making the rounds in turn of the century Western Europe, and here apparently in Russia too, though he was very influenced by what was going on at the West. His biography is very interesting just on its own. He was what we would again call now sort of an openly gay person at the time of him writing this, which would have been, again, the end of the 19th century, sort of Edwardian period. Really, really interesting stuff. If you look at my Goodreads review of this, I link a couple of other sources that if you're interested in understanding some of this context, you should check out. This is where E.M. Forster comes in with Maurice, because Maurice is also, I would argue, one of the only examples of kind of historical queer texts that don't paint it as a tragedy. And even later works, as recently as just as today, a lot of people, unfortunately, even in our voices literature, feel the need to express the tragedy of queerness. And I would never say, oh, you know, like when you're writing about your own experiences, it should be happy for the sake of optics. But it is, I think, nice to know that there are other narratives that exist. And this is one of them, with all the caveats we already discussed. The reason this was significant to me personally this year is because a lot of the works that it references are works that I also read either this or last year, such as the Symposium, such as the Iliad, just reading a little bit more about Walter Pater and about the it's one of those words I've never said out loud, I think. Pre-Raphaelites and the aestheticism movement in Victorian England. I was really glad that that knowledge base allowed me to understand a lot of the allusions that Kuzman makes in this book. So I would say you don't have to necessarily have that grounding for this to make sense, but it would certainly be helpful. And next up on the list of questions is mass appeal. So a book that you read this year that you would recommend to a really wide range of people. So for this one, it's another book that I kind of felt meh about. I liked it while I was reading it, but other than this particular prompt, I wouldn't probably ever bring this up. But it was Claire North's The First 15 Lives of Harry August. This is a really cute novel. It kind of exists at this intersection between sci-fi and fantasy in the sense that there is this magical element of people, not all, but a certain subset of people who reincarnate. So as far as we know, it just indefinitely. It's not a 9 lives kind of a thing. It's like, as the title implies, it's just, it goes on and on and on unless a certain set of circumstances comes about to prevent that reincarnation. You will just reincarnate forever and ever. But the caveat is that you will live the same life over and over again. So it's not like you get propelled forward in history. It's you are born under the same circumstances and grow up under the same circumstances and live through the same amount of time that you would have before, but your death on the other side can be influenced by a variety of factors. So maybe if you make different decisions, then that can influence the course of your life and your lifespan. So you can have lived thousands of years, but it'll be the same, roughly the same period over and over again. Really cool premise. And then there is also this sci-fi element to it, because one of the characters, the antagonist, their goal is to try to speed progress up in the world because they have lived through a period where they see enough of technological progress to kind of anticipate where it could go, and they want to bring that back to influence other world events. We're looking at the Cold War, looking at, World War II, things like that. The reason I felt this was kind of meh was just that even though there were interesting questions to consider coming out of this book, certain elements of the execution weren't, in my opinion, handled with a lot of finesse. So talking about the plot and outside of the context of the story itself, I think is infinitely more interesting than discussing what actually happens within the book. Again, I gave this about a 3.5, so it's good. You should give it a try. Next, the next prompt was to talk about a book that really surprised you. I don't usually get surprised by books because I am pretty selective when it comes to what I'm going to read. Not so much so that I don't read widely, but more so that I usually know something about the book before I read it. And so therefore it's really hard for a book to surprise me. This was another book club read, and I don't have a physical copy because I just borrowed, oh no I didn't. I listened to the audiobook of this. So this was We've Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. Exquisite. I loved this story. I thought this was fabulous. And as somebody who has a little bit of background in Gothic fiction, I thought this was a wonderful addition to that collection, and also really inventive in the ways that it subverts certain expectations of the genre. Of all of the, I guess, feminist literature that I read this year, this was by far my favorite. The weaponization of these traditionally sort of we viewed as weak feminine spaces like the kitchen, I thought was brilliant. This felt like a very cathartic revenge fantasy in which all of the things that would normally hold these two women back are the things that set them free. Weaponization of the kitchen space, of food, the rebellion against traditional female roles that Mary Cat just refuses to step into, and she's ostracized in the town for these reasons, but that sets her free. She does not thrive within that system. She thrives when she's on her own. And I can completely understand why female readers would really, really like this, or honestly why anybody who was socialized as a woman would really, really like this and certainly feel something about it. Basically, the storyline is that there is this girl, Mary Cat, who comes from a family where some time ago basically everyone was poisoned to death except for her, her uncle, and her sister. And it turned the town completely against what had before been a very well-regarded, affluent family. And so the 3 remaining members get completely ostracized and shut up in their old house. And the only one of the 3 of them who has any physical mobility particularly is Mary Cat, because her sister is super agoraphobic and her uncle is an invalid at this point. But she's crazy. Like, you realize this immediately. Everyone around her treats her very terribly because they just kind of think she's stupid and spacey and easy to pick on. But she, by living in this kind of fantasy world, is able to slough all of that off and be fairly happy until her isolated world with her sister and her uncle is sort of invaded by an outside force, which brings out this kind of evil, I guess you could say, mischievously evil side of her. This really shocked me. I knew what this was about before I went into it, but until I had actually read it, I think about it quite often. And okay, almost there. Next. Ooh. Okay, this is where we get into probably the spiciest hot take that I have for this entire video. And I might be accused of just not enjoying fun. But the next category is a book that disappointed you. Okay, listen. I do have an explanation for my choice. Try to bear with me. And by far, the biggest disappointment for me this year was Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. I know. But hear me out. Most of the disappointment that I had with this, honestly, was my own fault and stemmed from the fact that I allowed myself to get too hyped up for this. That's not Madeline Miller's fault. That's not this book's fault. That's mine. But I had other issues with this. The issues that I had with this could honestly fill an entire other video, so I'll be brief. Essentially, I thought this didn't quite have the message that she was aiming for, and I think that stems from some critical choices that she made in terms of character decision. That's a very vague explanation, but I feel like, barring pontificating about this for another 45 minutes, I can't really be any more specific than that. There were also issues that I had with the execution of other aspects of this book that could have been fixed had Miss Madeline Miller just read more slash fan fiction. Take from that what you will. Suffice it to say that I learned my lesson about the hype train from this. Next! Alright, we have finally made it down to the last category. I'm so excited to talk about how much I hated this. The last category, as added by myself, is the book that you liked the least. I think I can say with absolute certainty that my least favorite book of this year was another one that was incredibly highly rated on Goodreads and well liked by a lot of people, but I loathed it. and that was Matt Haig's The Midnight Library. Was this trash tier? No, but I found it super frustrating to read, and not in a fun way. It wasn't like, oh, I'm so frustrated with what this character is doing, because that would imply that you had some sort of investment. This book to me was like Matt Haig was somewhere and he saw the live, love, laugh platitude on something and was like, you know what? There needs to be a book about this. The premise, if you just describe the premise, sounds amazing. There is this concept of a midnight library, which essentially means that if a person is in this liminal space between life and death, that liminal space is a library, and all of the books in the library are all of their memories, all of their desires, their fears, their wishes, etc. The part of the library that is focused on in this book, though, is regret. So it's this idea that you can look at these different books of different regrets that you've had in your life and follow a different timeline if you had made a different choice. So it's all in the name of finding out how to make herself happy. And of course, and this isn't even a spoiler because I feel like this is so clear from the first page, she needs to realize that the real happiness comes from the friends we make along the way. Apparently Matt Haig is very well liked and respected in the like self-help and mental health awareness communities. I kind of get that. This was just so incredibly sugary, sweetly on the nose that it was laughable. He would actually include aphorisms in the story completely alone, just floating on the page, as though they were just incredibly profound bits of wisdom of some kind. That was all very cringe, but that was not what I loathed about this book. What I loathed was that the conclusion after all of this, because, okay, so, well, let's back up for a second. The bigger point about this is that this protagonist is very depressed and she tries to unalive herself at the beginning, and that's how she ends up in this liminal library. And according to Matt Haig, all she had to do was take a breath and recognize that the life that she had was the best life she was ever going to have. Like, that was the best life for her. And as soon as she realized that, all of her problems kind of melt away immediately. It's not even like there's this implication that this shift in thinking will ultimately make your life better and improve your life in some way. No, it's like she has this realization and then she's given all of the solutions to all of her problems. Loneliness, professional issues, sort of the implication of romantic issues, the end. And I just really dislike this because I feel like it comes from a very similar self-help, toxic positivity place, and yet also somehow at the same time is the Jordan Peterson clean your house before you enter into the world kind of narrative. And it's all very nice until you realize that sometimes people's problems are not internal. Sometimes depression can be influenced by outside factors, and so you kind of have to exit the house and engage with those perhaps systemic or societal or interpersonal issues before / at the same time that you're doing internal work. And the broader implication of this book is that that is not the case. Like, her getting fired was only sad because she didn't recognize that it wasn't the right job for her or something. And like, that's just nonsense. I don't understand why it's so popular. Like, okay, far be it from me if that book really positively influenced you, but I think its net benefit to the world is not as big as it thinks it is. And that's a shame, because the premise was so cool, and the idea of this library as purgatory, as a book lover and a reader, that was so cool. The aesthetic of that was so cool. But like, that was it. Nothing else was cool. And I thought that Matt Haig's writing was questionable at best. There were certain moments of dialogue where I just could not believe that this had gone through probably several edits without anybody pointing out that real people don't talk like fortune cookies. All right, well, not to end on a sour note, a positive thing from the 50 books that I read this year. I was really happy that I was able to do, I think, pretty good reviews for all of them, to broaden out and to read a lot of books that were by authors from a wider variety of countries. Libya, we had Japan, Barbados, couple of different European books, France, Russia, Poland. So I traveled a little bit more in my reading this year as well, which I thought that was fun. And I really think that's a cool idea and a really great way to get a lot of new perspectives so that you don't fall into that sort of echo chamber that people can get into, not only on social media, but even within fiction. And I hope to continue that into 2022. So let me know, what were your answers? Did you have any spicy takeaways from 2021's year in review? Do you have any really big goals for this upcoming year of reading? Let me know. Thank you for sitting through, if you've made it this far, all of my little reading musings and ramblings. And I hope to see you for more bookish musings and ramblings in the future. Cheers! Happy New Year! Go forth and read.